How do historians make sense of the past? Well, one way is to create categories. Things like republic or empire, continuity and change, and causes and consequences. And these categories do help us recognize patterns across enormous spans of time. But do they tell us everything? Not quite. You see, categories simplify complex historical processes that often unfold through gradual adaptation and changing relationships of power. And perhaps the same question can be asked of philosophy. For example, what's another way to understand Nietzsche's three metamorphoses? In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche describes three transformations of the spirit: the camel, lion, and the child. The camel accepts the burdens of tradition, while the lion challenges those traditions. And the child, they create new values through a joyful affirmation of life. And Nietzsche presents these as stages in the education of a free spirit, a progression through which an individual acquires, evaluates, and ultimately legislates values. But what happens when we read these categories historically? For instance, when Augustus died in AD 14, had he become Nietzsche's camel, lion, or child? Well, the answer really depends on how we understand historical development. And how should we understand historical development? Well, we know that every civilization receives something from the generations before it. Things like traditions, institutions, and religious beliefs, as well as political ideas and ways of behaving. And with each generation, these structures and values either continue, lose their authority, or form the basis of new social arrangements. And Nietzsche's genealogical investigation of values also follows this process, as they accumulate, evolve, and acquire new meanings over time. So what happens if we apply this to Augustus? He begins his life carrying Rome's political and cultural legacy. First he receives Julius Caesar's name, then the expectations of Rome's aristocracy, and finally responsibility for the Republic itself. And Roman education cultivated this willingness to bear obligations handed down through generations. And the Republic depended upon citizens who accepted responsibility before exercising authority, making Nietzsche's camel a remarkably Roman image. But was Augustus only the camel? Not for long. See, the civil wars transformed that legacy into a political problem. Yes, the Republic still existed with its institutions and traditions, yet each now confronted new political conditions. And Augustus spent years deciding how those traditions could guide Rome's future. As a result, he left some customs remaining, while others took on new purposes as Rome adapted to a changing world. And this long process of judgment resembles Nietzsche's lion, whose task it is to examine inherited values and decide whether they should be accepted, adapted, or destroyed. And what about the child? By the end of his reign, Augustus had created something new. Yes, the Senate still met, magistrates still held office, and republican language still described Roman government. Yet these familiar institutions now formed part of a constitutional order centered upon his authority. For Nietzsche, the child creates because it possesses the power to begin anew with youthful innocence. And Augustus certainly created by arranging old materials into a new political order that later generations recognized as both familiar and transformed. So, does Augustus simply move from camel to lion to child? I don't really think so. You see, the camel remains throughout his life, carrying Rome's traditions, religion, and collective memory. The lion remains, judging which traditions could strengthen Rome under new historical conditions. And the child remains, reorganizing those traditions in new political relationships that gave the Principate its stability. Therefore, the three metamorphoses become three ways of relating to inherited values, where every citizen or person carries, judges, and reorganizes that inheritance. And just as historians use categories to organize the complexity of the past, Nietzsche's framework offers another lens through which historical development can be explored. Indeed, this process has shown us one of the reasons why historians and philosophers create categories in the first place. See, categories organize an immensely complicated world into forms we can work with. They give us language for recognizing patterns, comparing different moments in history, and following ideas across time. As we apply them to new people, events, and societies, those categories accumulate depth and broaden our understanding. And Augustus shows that these categories can coexist within a single historical life. His example gives Nietzsche's ideas historical depth, while Nietzsche's ideas offer a new way of understanding Augustus. And that begs the question, how many other moments in history might reveal new patterns once we begin reading them in conversation with philosophy?